we were discussing Babylon. We have it in our mind that when the Bible says go out of Babylon, it's telling us go out of the church. And it's a difficult thing because the language is very mysterious. God calls it Mystery Babylon to let us know that He has hidden truth concerning this. And so it's very hard for us to think of the fall of Babylon and going out of Babylon not as the end of the church age, but as the end of the Great Tribulation and the beginning of Judgment Day on the world. Just remember this, and I'll give you a few reasons why Babylon is a picture of the world. When we heard the study of the book of Jeremiah through family radio, and when we heard that those in Judea had to go into captivity, remember that? It was taught, well, the Jews historically had to leave Judah and go to Babylon into captivity. That was God's will. Now, what was the spiritual teaching of that? What was the teaching of the Bible concerning Judea? What did Judea represent? The church. All the Jews that God was speaking to in Judah were types and figures of the New Testament churches and congregations. They had to leave Judea. We understood that you must come out of the church. That was correct. And go to Babylon. And what did Babylon represent? The world. So we've already had that understanding that Babylon represented the world. It just got kind of confused because of the great similarity that God uses in discussing Babylon. Like He'll use almost identical verses describing the judgment on Babylon as the judgment on Jerusalem or on Judah. And now we understand why. Because it's the same cup. The judgment on Judah or Jerusalem was a judgment on the church. And God uses almost, in some places, identical language to describe the judgment on Babylon because it's the same cup of wrath. It's the same judgment. But a second thing is the Great Tribulation period. We have known for some time is typified by the 70-year period from 609 BC through 539 BC. For instance, in Jeremiah chapter 29, it says in verse 10, "For thus saith Jehovah, that after 70 years are accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place." 70-year period, 609, 539. And then what happened in 539 BC? Historically, the Bible's clear. The Medes and the Persians came against Babylon and defeated it and overcame Babylon. And that 70-year period, we've understood, is a representation of the entire Great Tribulation period of 23 years. While the fall of Babylon historically doesn't point to the fall of the church, because when Babylon took over Judah earlier in that 70-year period, that would point to the fall of the church, but the end of the 70 years doesn't. It points to the fall of the ones that took over the church, Satan and his emissaries. It points to the end of the Great Tribulation, because the 70 years typifies the Great Tribulation. So the fall of Babylon, in that sense too, would identify with May 21, 2011, not May 21, 1988, when the Great Tribulation began. So that's the second reason. Now let's look at this verse in Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51, verse 49. And it says there, "As Babylon has caused the slain of Israel to fall." All right, now Israel would here represent who? The churches. Babylon has caused the slain of Israel to fall. So Babylon, we know Satan is likened to the king of Babylon and his kingdom of darkness, as God loosed Satan to come against the churches and congregations. He killed the professed believers within the churches and congregations. It was Satan, as Babylon has caused the slain of Israel to fall, and that would be the fall of the churches and the congregations. So at Babylon shall fall the slain of all the earth. Now that's saying something different. Babylon caused the slain of Israel to fall. That is, it was instrumental in the judgment on the churches. And as a result of that, God's going to do something. And He's going to do it at Babylon. If you go back to Jeremiah 50, it says in verse 15, "Shout against her round about, she has given her hand, her foundations are fallen, her walls are thrown down, for it is the vengeance of Jehovah. Take vengeance upon her, as she has done unto her." And then in verse 28, "The voice of them that flee and escape out of the land of Babylon, to declare in Zion the vengeance of Jehovah our God, the vengeance of His temple." Why vengeance? Because Babylon has caused the slain of Israel to fall. God, loosing Satan, has used him to destroy the churches and congregations. And in turn, after that period of time is over, then at Babylon shall fall the slain of all the earth. Judgment Day. Judgment Day is when the slain of all the earth fall. And that's why when we read anywhere about the fall of Babylon, it came after 70 years, and that 70 years typified the Great Tribulation, and it comes as a result of God taking vengeance for His temple. So the temple was already destroyed, and it is pointing to Judgment Day itself. Now, also look at Isaiah 13, verse 1. "The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see." Now, we went over this before. There's several places where God will speak of the burden of such and such, and then He goes on to discuss it. He continues to discuss that which was in view. And it's the same thing in Isaiah 13. The context is set by verse 1, the burden of Babylon. Well, what does Isaiah 13 talk about? It doesn't take long. In verse 6, "How ye, for the day of Jehovah is at hand." Verse 9, "Behold, the day of Jehovah cometh." Verse 10, "For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light." And that's language that matches Matthew 24:29, immediately after the tribulation. Verse 11, "And I will punish the world for their evil." The context of this chapter is, without question, Judgment Day. It's not judgment on the churches. It's judgment on the world. And in this context, notice it goes on to say in verse 13, "I will shake the heavens and the earth shall remove." Then it says in verse 14, "And it shall be as the chase roe, and as the sheep that no man taketh up. They shall every man turn to his own people, and flee everyone into his own land. Everyone that is found shall be thrust through, and everyone that is joined unto them shall fall by the sword. Their children also shall be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses shall be spoiled, and their wives ravished. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them." Why the Medes? Who destroyed Babylon? The Medes and the Persians. And God is talking about the burden of Babylon. This is its burden, that it's Judgment Day, and it's time to judge Babylon. It's the day of Babylon's fall. And it goes on to say in verse 19, "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." Back to Babylon. It's going back to Babylon because that's what God's been talking about all the way through. So when God says that Babylon is fallen, as He says in Revelation 18 and Revelation 14 and other places, we have to think, well, Babylon didn't fall during that 70 years. It didn't fall during the Great Tribulation. It fell at the end of the 70 years. At the end of the Great Tribulation, God now will cause the slain of all the earth to fall at Babylon. It's Judgment Day. And that becomes very important in chapters like the one we're looking at in Jeremiah 50, because as we discussed last time, look at verse 2. "Declare ye among the nations, and publish, and set up a standard, publish, and conceal not, say, Babylon is taken." You see the difference concerning what Babylon represents? If Babylon is the end of the church age, then, well, that's a different matter. You know, God wanted us to warn the world that the sword is coming, but I don't remember necessarily that we were specifically to go out and tell everyone it's the end of the church age, it's the end of the church age. That was a bit of the information, a part of what God opened up, but you see, this is a different matter. When we understand that Babylon's fall identifies with the beginning of Judgment Day itself on May 21 in the year 2011. And then God is saying, declare among the nations and publish, set up a standard, publish, and conceal not. That's a very strong emphasis. Don't hide it. Set up a standard. The standard is like a flag that you cause everyone to see. An ensign, it's called in Isaiah chapter 11. And also publish. It's completely contrary to what we initially thought. It is completely contrary. We had thought, well, we don't have to say anything about this, about the world being in Judgment Day. And even some people came out and said, well, we're to hide ourselves. And literally they meant we're not to say anything about the Bible. We're not to discuss the Bible at all. And God nowhere in the Bible ever gives His people that instruction. We're always to share truth. And by the way, God is commanding us to feed sheep. Well, how do you feed sheep when you hide? How do you feed sheep when you're quiet and you don't publish things? We don't know who the sheep are. Is this the sum total of a great multitude? No, there's a great multitude out there in all the nations of the earth, and we have no idea who they are. And that would mean we have to go about things exactly as we did before. When we were seeking lost sheep, what do? You take the seed and you throw it everywhere. Every opportunity you have, you spread the gospel, because we don't know if that's one of God's elect, and we don't know if one of God's elect is over here. And it's the same thing with sheep. How do we know who God saved? We have no idea who God might have saved. And so we have to also, when nourishing spiritually God's sheep, do the exact same thing. You spread it far and wide that they might hear.